Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, taking inspiration from history. In the Wilds, the gynosphinx. And in the Tavern, what would you do if history was lost? How's it going today, everybody? I hope everyone is having an excellent day. Excited to talk some more about history with you all today, and how we can use these past real-life events in order to inspire us in our storytelling. Before we get into all of that, though, just some announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube if you'd like to listen to the podcast that way. And wherever you listen to the podcast, we would appreciate if you would give us a rating. And finally, be sure to check us out on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there, as we have recently revamped it and are still in the process of fine-tuning 2 new tiers, including our highest tier, which allows you to actually be a part of the brand new show we announced, Plot Hooks Adventures. This new show is bringing together members of the Plot Hooks team, different creators in the TTRPG space, as well as you, the patrons, to come together for one-shot adventures, which will be released on this podcast feed. We also are releasing weekly magic items for both of those upper tiers. I'm finishing up the next supplementary release, which is going to have 6 new monster stat blocks, 6 new animals, and 6 new NPC stat blocks for you to use in your games. And that's available for all the tiers up there on Patreon. We genuinely appreciate your support, and even if you're unable to support us directly on Patreon, we just really appreciate you listening and being a part of the Plot Hooks family. Thank you all so very much. But without further ado, let's dive into our main topic today, taking inspiration from history. Often when we're developing a new campaign or storyline as a dungeon master, or if we're making a new character or a new part of our backstory as a player, we can easily get stuck. We can run out of ideas and be searching for inspiration. And there's lots of great places to go to for inspiration, from movies or plays or books or some other form of media, or even storylines from other TTRPG campaigns. And these are excellent sources for ideas. I use them a lot in my own DMing. But there's a source ripe for providing inspiration that we often miss, and that's history. Real-life stories. Reality is a great place for inspiration. It's where a lot of our favorite stories and things like movies or books drew inspiration from to begin with. There's so many amazing stories and characters, both in the positive vein and in a terrifyingly negative sense. And largely, we only talk about or even know a tiny part of our human history. There's so much gold out there which we just aren't aware of. It's just not common knowledge. But if we delve into these things, there's such a wonderfully rich wealth of story inspiration for us. Perhaps some of us get turned off of history because it's a school subject, and sometimes the way that it's covered is rather boring. But there's so many amazing things there, which are not only amazing just to learn about, but can give us great inspiration for telling our stories. So today, we're going to go over 6 of these areas where history provides great inspiration for, and some examples in each category. Now, before we continue any further, I do have to give you a content warning that I will be discussing some rather distressing historical events and people, and other things which some may find distressing. So switch off this podcast now if that is what is best for your mental health. All right, so the first of these 6 categories that we want to look at is just past events. Specific events can be great things to look at in history because they can fit in really nicely as a part of a storyline of a campaign, or just great to set a one-shot in. A great example of this is the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. This rampant blaze destroyed over 3 square miles of the city of Chicago, which left over 100,000 people without homes. Over 17,000 buildings destroyed and 300 people lost their lives. And it quite literally was an exercise in everything going wrong. Not only were well over half of the buildings in the city at that time made completely out of wood, but Chicago was under a severe drought at the time, and they only had 185 firefighters with 17 horse-drawn pumpers in order to keep the entire city safe. And to make matters worse, there was a reporting error by the watchman at the time, and the firefighters ended up being sent to the wrong place. There were all sorts of crazy things that just worked together to create this massive blaze, which destroyed so much of Chicago. And this type of scenario would be great to set your players into. In fact, I've done this. I ran a Call of Cthulhu one-shot set during and after the Great Chicago Fire. Another historical event is Pompeii. This is something that most everybody has heard of. It was a coastal town in Italy that was completely destroyed in 79 AD with the eruption of the volcano that we know as Mount Vesuvius. The eruption literally buried the town and the surrounding area with 10 to 20 feet of volcanic ash and pumice. Not only that, but at the time of the eruption, the city had just recovered from a large earthquake that had taken place 17 years prior. And you can run a campaign in this type of situation, or have a particular town be nearby a volcano, and perhaps they don't leave for perhaps religious reasons. Maybe there's a sacred significance to the specific spot where the town is formed. And yet, you're looking at this as a party and you see where most of the town was just recently destroyed by an earthquake, and now you're starting to see smoke come out of this mountain, and you're questioning whether or not they should really be here. And this is a scenario that you can put your party into. There's also past events like the USS Indianapolis, which was a naval vessel which was active in World War II for the United States. And it was tasked in 1945 with a very secret mission, delivering parts of Little Boy, which was the nuclear bomb that would eventually be used on Hiroshima. They were to deliver it to an Air Force base on the island of Tinian. But after making its delivery, and as the USS Indianapolis was on its way back to the Philippines, a Japanese submarine sank the ship with a torpedo. And unfortunately, due to the secretive nature of this mission, it took a long time for them to be found. Out of the nearly 1,200 crew aboard, 300 sank with the ship, but the rest were in the water for 4 days, where they literally went through not just exposure and dehydration and all the things that you'd expect from shipwrecks, but they literally went through massive shark attacks. Only 316, just a little bit over a quarter of the crew survived. But it's not just negative events that we can look at in the past. There's plenty of positive ones too. Perhaps the most famous example of all of these is D-Day. The Allied forces landing at Normandy. Thousands upon thousands of people putting their lives on the line. Many of them perishing, but doing it to fight for what was right. The circumstances, such as the unknown soldier, that individual that was dressed up as a soldier and then washed ashore intentionally with fake papers so that the Germans would be thrown off of the scent so that they would not know exactly where the Allied forces were planning on landing. There's so many different great historical events which we can look at and incorporate directly into our stories, like I did with the Great Chicago Fire, or just take elements of them and incorporate them into our narratives in a real and fascinating way. Secondly, not only do we have past events, but we also have past wars. Perhaps you want a combat between nations in your setting. Maybe you want it to be the focus of the narrative, or perhaps it's just a backdrop designed to alter events at home where the campaign is actually happening. And unfortunately, history's quite full of wars to look at. There's wars of all shapes and sizes and purposes to help inform the story that you want to tell in your game. Want a story where there's a clear bad guy? Someone where there's a conquering people overrunning another group? Look no further than Julius Caesar in 1st century BC and his conquest of the Gallic regions of Europe. This story, which is reported to us through history by Caesar himself in his book, Caesar uses multiple excuses, such as the protection of Rome, in order to continue the conquest of a people and a culture, and what ultimately amounted to a near full extermination of the Celtic peoples of the region. All of this while being couched in the reality that Caesar is using these military achievements to set himself up politically to become dictator of the Roman Republic prior to his eventual assassination in 44 BC. Want a brutal war between rival powers? Well, staying with Rome, look back into the Punic Wars, which were a series of 3 wars that took place between Rome and Carthage. The Second Punic War saw one of the worst battles in the history of warfare, the Battle of Cannae, where the Carthaginians, led by Hannibal, who exhibited tactical brilliance despite being outnumbered. He outmaneuvered the Roman army, surrounded it, but then he proceeded to systematically massacre them. It was, again, quite possibly one of the worst battles in the history of warfare. Want conflicts and touchy politics between numerous factions? You can look at something like feudal Japan and the many civil wars that were fought between the various shoguns and their samurai. And what about how war affects people back home? Perhaps the best source of this is the First and Second World Wars in Europe. Look at the effects that people endured under occupying forces, such as those in French territories under German rule in World War II. Look at how the press and the radio were only allowed to broadcast propaganda for the Germans. Look at the rationing of products, the curfews, the fact that the people producing military arms had to continue to work, but now their products were being forcibly made for the Germans. Look at the resistances, such as that by the Russian-born but French-naturalized citizen Boris Vildé, who helped with the creation of anti-occupation publications, which unfortunately was short-lived before he was discovered, and he was executed a year later after his discovery. But Vildé did not ever give up the fight. According to Matthew Cobb in his book, The Resistance, The French Fight Against the Nazis, Vildé's last words were, "I love France. I love this beautiful country. Yes, I know it can be small-minded, selfish, politically rotten, and a victim of its old glory, but with all of these faults, it remains enormously human and will not sacrifice its stature." You can also look at the effects of World War II in England. Here we have no actual occupation, but there were effects of things like the constant air raids and just the closeness of the war. Over 1 million people, especially kids, were evacuated from areas like London to areas of the country with lesser risk. You also get to see cultural things, like what's important to a country during times like this. In this time of history, Britain actually purchased nearly the entire world's supply of tea. They thought that it would be bad for morale if they ran out, so they just bought up everything to make sure that they wouldn't. There's so much we can learn about how we incorporate wars into our settings and in what different ways we can do it by looking at history. Third, we can look at past heroes. History is full of heroic figures that stood up for what's right. And we can learn a lot about creating those characters for our games by looking at them in history. Some of these are legendary figures who stood up for what was right in their time. Perhaps my favorite example of this is Nelson Mandela, a South African revolutionary who worked to overthrow apartheid and the government that supported it in his native country. He spent 27 years in prison for his actions, before being released by the South African president at the time, F.W. de Klerk, and Mandela at that point led efforts to finally end apartheid, and ultimately became president of the entire country in the nation's first multiracial election. And if you're seeking to dismantle racist stereotypes, which so often exist within role-playing settings, perhaps look no further than Mandela for inspiration on how to tell that story. Other figures in this vein could be Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, and William Wilberforce. Some become heroes by doing great deeds, such as those who are wondrous explorers and go somewhere where no one ever did before. Unfortunately, many historical explorers become more villain than hero because they become colonizers rather than explorers, but there are some great stories of pure exploration. Sir Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing were a great example of this, as they partnered to be the first people to climb the world's tallest mountain, Mount Everest, in 1953. And not only that, but Hillary would go on to visit both the North and the South Pole, becoming the first person to do all three of those amazing feats. And there's a ton of great female heroes as well. History tends to mostly record the male perspective, because they're the ones who task themselves with writing that history, unfortunately. But there's so many wonderful female heroes to glean inspiration from. The biblical figure of Hadassah, better known by her Persian name of Esther, was a hero of her people, rescuing her people boldly. Ada Lovelace, a 19th century mathematician who, with her work with Charles Babbage's analytical engine, can literally be considered the world's first computer programmer. Elizabeth Fry, who advocated in the Victorian period for better conditions in prisons and for those who are mentally ill. She was actually called the Angel of Prisons, if I'm not mistaken. Marie Curie, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and so many more. There's many great heroes to gain inspiration from. Fourthly, just as there's many heroes, there's also numerous villains as well. There's villains of conquest, such as the aforementioned Julius Caesar in his conquest of the Gauls. Genghis Khan as well. And depending on how gritty you want to go, you can go really dark. An example of really dark stuff is the ancient Assyrian kingdom, with kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal. I'm not going to read many of the disgusting things that they did, absolutely atrocious war crimes. If you would like to look it up, you can certainly find it online. One of the things about the ancient Assyrians is that they loved to brag about all these things that they did. Just one example, which, believe it or not, is tame, is when Ashurbanipal took a captured leader and pierced his chin with a hand dagger and passed a rope through his jaw and then hooked him up to a dog chain and made him live in a kennel. There's absolutely terrible villains of conquest out there in history for us to look at. There's also villains in terms of tyrants, not necessarily even conquering villains, but just people who ruled what they already had in a very tyrannical and diabolical way. And unfortunately, there's quite a lot of them in the world at the moment. But history is filled with them too, perhaps none more famous than Nero, a chaotic evil figure if there ever was one. And of course, there's also just villains in terms of bad people. The one I'll highlight here is Countess Elizabeth Bathory. She was a Hungarian, and she holds the Guinness World Record for being the most prolific female serial killer. She lived from 1560 to 1614, and let's just say that while there's no evidence for this per se, there's some out there who believe that she inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Odds are she wasn't the inspiration for that book, but just being in that conversation keys you in on some very vampiric tendencies that the Countess employed. But of course, with all of this hero and villain talk, there is nuance to play with here in our games. Not so much with the Countess. I'm pretty sure with her, you just, she's just a villain. She's just the big bad evil guy that you're going to have to fight and kill because she's terrorizing a town. But with those, like the conquering rulers, there's some nuance. As modern observers, we can look back and see the right and wrong in any individual's actions. But in the moment, historically, one man's villain is another man's hero. Julius Caesar was a hero of Rome. He may have attempted the systematic destruction of the Celtic people, but he was a Roman hero. And that's a reality to play with in our games. The response to different figures in your setting will be different based on who is doing the responding. And if your party is traversing between different areas where perhaps the response to a war or whatever happens to be going on in a particular situation, the difference in the response can really help the party see the nuance in the story. And that could make for a really interesting collaborative narrative. Fifthly, and I won't spend too much time on this, there's past governments. There's all sorts of different governmental systems. Perhaps the most common in our games are things like monarchies. And there's many great examples of that in history in Europe, perhaps most famously Britain, but you can learn a lot from other past monarchies in Europe as well. There's empires. The Roman Empire or the Japanese Empire that went from the Meiji Restoration until after World War II. And often in these type of settings, you get a sense that the emperor is divine themselves, not just ruling with divine right, so to speak, but actually divine. There's more democratic systems, such as councils. The Roman Republic, before its downfall in the 1st century BC, is a good example of this. City-states. Look no further than ancient Greece. We already mentioned feudal Japan, which is a great example of feudal systems. So if you're looking for perhaps a more unique government than just having a king in every territory of your setting, again, look at history. You'll find some great inspiration. The final thing that we wanted to look at is just past characters. There's a huge amount of incredibly interesting people throughout history. Elizabeth Cochrane Seaman, perhaps better known by her pen name of Nellie Bly, was an American investigative journalist. She once went undercover at an asylum, literally having to work herself up to that by pretending to be insane and checking into a boarding house called Temporary Homes for Females, doing things like staying up all night so that she looked crazy before she could get into the asylum. And once she was there, and the whole reason for her going there in the first place, she exposed the terrible conditions and abuses that were afflicted there, and actually got the asylum to implement reforms. She also traveled around the world in an attempt to turn the fictional book Around the World in 80 Days into reality. And she did. She traversed the globe in just 72 days. Edith Wilson was perhaps the most important First Lady of the United States ever, and the closest thing we've had, perhaps, to a female president. That's because in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson, Edith's husband, had a very bad stroke. But Edith stepped up to the plate. And while she made no policy decisions herself, she became the sole gateway between matters of state and the president. She would take all the information from the cabinet, and she would review it, and she would determine what matters were important enough for the president to take a look at, and which were not. An amazing woman. Percy Julian was an African American man who fought through racial prejudices and segregation to become one of the most important chemists the world has ever seen. Despite the evils of Jim Crow, Julian was one of the first African Americans to ever earn a doctorate in chemistry and would go on to pioneer the synthesis of drugs from plants. His work built the foundation for the production of cortisone. He also pioneered the chemical synthesis of hormones like progesterone and testosterone. The last one I'll mention quickly is a person we have no idea who they were. We know them simply as Agent 355, a famous spy, and we have no idea who she was. She was a woman working as an informant in New York City during the Revolutionary War, and she was instrumental in exposing Jean-Andre and Benedict Arnold. Jean-Andre was the British mayor who was in charge of the British Secret Service in the U.S. and was involved with turning Benedict Arnold to the British side, and she exposed him. And while there are theories about who she was, we genuinely have no idea for sure, except for the fact that we know that she was a female. But these 6 things, past events, past wars, past heroes, past villains, past governments, and past characters, are all things that we can look at and glean so much for our own settings and stories. So I hope this has inspired you that the next time you're looking for inspiration and are wondering how the heck you're going to get it, well, just look into history. There's lots of amazing stories that we can pull from for our own tabletop role-playing experience. But I think that's about enough on that subject for today. Let's head out into the wilds and look at a sphinx. Alright, we're out here in the wilderness. Today we're going to be looking at the gynosphinx. I wanted to pick something that was history connected, and the gynosphinx certainly is that. It's one of 2 sphinxes that are listed in the monster manual on page 280, the other being the androsphinx. Sphinxes in general in Dungeons & Dragons are based off of the mythological creatures of the same name. They're winged lions with human faces, and they guard knowledge. In D&D specifically, according to the Master Manual, the secrets and treasures of the gods. They're one of the creatures that you're perhaps most likely to encounter in a lair because they really never leave it. They live in isolation as different individuals and groups come up to them seeking these particular treasures of the gods and have to face a test that the Sphinx puts to them. Pass the test and you'll be rewarded. Fail the test, and it's not going to go so well for you. But all the Sphinx essentially does is just sit there guarding these secrets. They don't even have to eat or sleep. Now, the gynosphinx specifically is the sphinx which has a female humanoid head. And reading directly out of the monster manual, they are virtual libraries of knowledge and lore. They ask riddles and present puzzles to test the wit of supplicants that come to learn their secrets. Some are willing to bargain with such supplicants for treasure or service. Gynosphinxes are slightly weaker than their androsphinx counterparts, being a challenge rating 11 compared to the others' 17. But generally speaking, with a gynosphinx, the goal is generally answering riddles, not actually fighting them. But if you happen to answer the riddle incorrectly or to fail the particular test, that's whenever combat is going to come into play. They do have legendary actions. They can make a claw attack or teleport or cast a spell. And they do have spell casting, the most powerful spells that it has access to being legend lore, banishment, and greater invisibility. But the biggest thing to me on their stat block is their inscrutable feature. which is that it's immune to any effect that can sense its emotion or read its thoughts, as well as any divination spell that it refuses. Insight checks made to ascertain the Sphinx's intentions or sincerity have disadvantage. In addition to this, it has true sight of 120 feet and a passive perception of 19. So inscrutable is a very great word for this creature. If you have a party that is used to talking their way out of situations, used to perceiving and using their cunning and manipulation skills in order to win social encounters, they're not going to be able to do that with the Sphinx. They're going to have to come down and actually face the Sphinx's test, because it's going to be very hard to do anything other than that. And for that reason, I like throwing these at those type of parties. It can really throw a wrench into a particular party's plan. Perhaps they infiltrated a ruin seeking to get a particular item, and they come across a Sphinx, and now they can't just fight or talk their way out of it. They've got to actually think and face this Sphinx's challenge. Going a little bit past the stat block here, I also love the idea of using a Sphinx as a mount. Not for the party, but if you have a particular individual, like a godlike being or someone else who's just really powerful, having a Sphinx that serves them is such an incredible display of power. Throwing that in will wow your players, and they would be in absolute awe, and it will really get across the message you're trying to send that this individual is someone who is boss. But really, Sphinxes are just cool, and it's hard to find too many situations where you can actually throw them into your campaigns. So if you get an opportunity to, I would highly recommend trying to do so. They're really cool. Well, I think that about wraps up the wilds. Let's get out of here and head back to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if history was lost? Particularly what I'm thinking of here is scenarios where there's gaps in recorded history. And that can occur through a number of factors. One is just simply memory. History is something that's recorded through memory in most TTRPG settings. There's no audio or video or image recording, which takes something directly from reality and into the annals of history online, like we have in modern day. No, if somebody wants to record something in history, they have to remember it, write it down, and pass it on to the next generation, or at least use oral tradition and pass it on verbally through generations. So what happens if memory is altered? What happens if a particular village loses their memory for some reason? What happens if that memory is changed? Maybe there's a nefarious force which is actually manipulating people in this particular area. Or maybe there's some environmental factor which is causing them to lose their memory. Interesting options to explore. You can also lose history by losing documents. Things such as a library, or a palace burning down, or even an entire city being destroyed in something like we mentioned earlier, like Pompeii. History is lost there. There are events which were recorded which may have only been recorded there. Again, we're talking in fantasy settings of pseudo-medieval times. There's all sorts of knowledge which all the time gets lost. If there wasn't, there'd be no exploring of ruins. Perhaps if the party is trying to find a particular bit of information and they discover that that information was just lost, and now instead of an easy trip to the library, so to speak, they have to actually go investigate an ancient ruin themselves in order to dig out the information by hand. Perhaps physical recordings like that are altered in some subtle way. Think the medieval equivalent of Star Wars Attack of the Clones, where the planet Kamino was just erased from the Jedi archives. What happens if somebody does that to try to keep their actions on the down low? All of these can really play up a great sense of mystery and investigation for a campaign arc, where there's something going on or there's something that the party wants to find, and for some reason the information is lost or it's hard to obtain. Or maybe it isn't even something nefarious that's lost, it's just something that is so ancient that is just hard to find information on. And that constraint of information becomes a story point. Even with nothing nefarious going on, the party is just taking time to try to unravel these threads to understand the greater campaign narrative. And it can be really interesting. But I think that's about all the time that we have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks very much for listening. Be sure to check out our Patreon and our social media. We hope you're looking forward to Plot Hooks adventures. I know we are. And again, thanks for listening. I'm Samuel. Thanks from the rest of the Plot Hooks team. Matt, Mike, Dave, Steve, Zach, Becca, and podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.